There comes a time when your voice isn't the tool, it's your silence. The stillness that once felt like punishment becomes your power. In relationships where love has become a battlefield for the emotionally avoidant, your silence doesn't mean defeat, it signals a divine shift. See, the world has taught us that making noise gets attention, that being loud proves we care, that chasing is the same as loving. But when God calls you into silence, it's not about abandonment, it's about alignment. You're not retreating, you're resetting, and in that quiet space, the person who thought your presence was permanent begins to realize that your absence might be eternal. Let's walk into the revelation that your silence isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And that wisdom, it stirs the spirit of the avoidant like nothing else can. Silence isn't punishment, it's preparation. When you grow through emotional chaos, through the constant reaching and never being met halfway, there comes a divine awakening where you no longer react out of fear, you respond in faith. Silence becomes the language of the healed. It's not the kind of silence that comes from shutting down. It's the kind that comes from rising up, from knowing that your worth no longer needs to be shouted or proved, just lived. And in that place, in that sacred hush, God begins to work. Because when you've dealt with someone avoidant, someone who recoils when things get real, who disappears the moment you get close, you start to believe that making noise is the only way to be seen, that if you just say it louder, clearer, more desperately, maybe they'll understand. Maybe they'll stay, but that cycle isn't love, it's survival. And God didn't call you to survive in someone else's emotional desert. He called you to thrive in His promises. So when you stop speaking, when you no longer send that text, no longer explain yourself, no longer plead for connection, it's not that you don't care, it's that you care differently now. Your silence is sacred. It's not the absence of love, it's the presence of boundaries. It's the divine act of preparation, not only for what God's about to do in them, but what He's about to do in you. See, your silence gives space for clarity. It quiets the chaos long enough for you to hear God whisper your name again. Not the name they called you out of their fear, but the name God gave you in His grace. And that silence, it does something powerful. It reveals what words could never expose, because when you go quiet, you're no longer enabling. You're no longer giving CPR to what's already spiritually expired, and that silence echoes. It gets loud in the ears of the avoidant. Suddenly, the comfort of your always being there isn't so certain. The pattern is broken, the routine is interrupted, and that fear, the very thing they were trying to avoid by keeping you at arm's length, becomes the only thing they can feel. But this silence isn't about revenge, it's about reverence. It's a response to God's call to stand still and know that He is God, that He can fight battles your words never could, that He can speak into hearts you've cried over for too long, that He can convict, confront, and correct in ways you were never meant to carry. So you step back, not to watch them fall, but to let yourself rise. You let the silence prepare you. Prepare you for healing, for elevation, for the people who won't run from intimacy, but who will walk through it with you. Prepare you for a love that doesn't flinch when things get hard. Prepare you for the kind of peace that doesn't require a performance. Because when you stop filling the space with explanations, apologies, and emotional labor, you create room for God to move. And when God moves, He doesn't just fix the situation, He transforms it. And in that transformation, He prepares you for more than you lost, more than you settled for, more than you thought you deserved. There's a kind of silence that isn't passive, it's prophetic. It's not the shutting of a door out of spite, but the opening of a spiritual dimension where truth begins to echo. Avoidant people run from closeness not because they don't care, but because closeness requires them to confront parts of themselves they've buried. And when you go silent, not to manipulate, not to punish, but to protect your peace, it's like a mirror is held up to their soul. Suddenly, there's nothing left to distract them from the reality they've been avoiding, that intimacy isn't just an invitation to connection, it's an exposure of everything they've refused to face. Avoidants crave love like anyone else, but the moment love asks for vulnerability, they retreat. They build walls, they create distance, they disappear behind humor or work or needing space. They've mastered the art of self-preservation, but what happens when the person they always assumed would be there is suddenly quiet, not slamming doors, not yelling, not chasing, just still, just gone from the emotional tug-of war, that silence. It doesn't confirm their fears. It confronts them, and for the first time they have to sit in the very discomfort they've always tried to escape. Because your silence removes the noise they've depended on, the comfort of your checking in, the texts, the just making sure you're okay, the explaining, the overfunctioning, the showing up when they didn't ask and didn't reciprocate. All of that stops, and it's in that space, in the quiet aftermath, that the avoidant has to face the fear they've been running from all along. The fear of being truly seen and possibly losing the one person who saw them anyway. See, they didn't realize your presence was grace. They thought your consistency was weakness, but your silence reframes the narrative. It shows them that love isn't a given, that people don't stay forever if they're constantly being pushed away. That intimacy isn't a threat, it's a mirror, and now that you're no longer cushioning their fear, they have to wrestle with the question, why did they stop talking? And even deeper, why did I push away someone who only wanted to love me? But here's the truth. Your silence was never about making them feel bad. It was about giving them room to feel it all, because sometimes love needs to step back so growth can step forward. You can't teach someone to be intimate with you, but your absence can teach them to confront what's blocking it. Your silence becomes the soil where conviction can grow, not guilt, not shame, but a deeper awareness of their own patterns. And that awareness, that's where God can work. He can step into the space you surrendered and whisper truths louder than your voice ever could. He can begin to dismantle the strongholds of avoidance, fear of abandonment, fear of inadequacy, fear of being known. And maybe, just maybe, they'll begin to see that what they called space was actually self-sabotage, that what they thought was protection was just a prison, and they'll start asking the questions that lead to healing. But you keep holding your peace, because your silence isn't a void, it's a vessel. It carries weight, it carries revelation, it carries a new standard, one that says, I'm not going to beg you to love me. I'm going to love myself enough to let silence speak where my voice used to shout. And in that stillness, you become a reflection of what true intimacy requires: honesty, consistency, and presence. Not just physical presence, but emotional presence. The kind that says, if you want me, you've got to show up too. There's a moment when you stop responding, not out of bitterness, but out of awareness. A sacred stillness comes over you, not because you gave up, but because you woke up. And in that stillness, something begins to shift, not just in you, but in the entire dynamic. See, when you're in a relationship with someone who avoids emotional depth, they depend on your reaction to maintain control. You're over-explaining, you're chasing, your attempts to decode their distance. It becomes fuel. It tells them they still have emotional power without ever having to give emotional presence. But when you grow quiet, when you sit in stillness, the script flips. Suddenly, the avoidant isn't calling the shots anymore. They can't rely on your responses to fill the silence, to fix the awkwardness, to cushion the consequences of their withdrawal. Your stillness interrupts the cycle. Because every time you used to chase after clarity, they didn't have to offer any. Every time you filled the gaps with effort, they never had to meet you halfway. But now you're still, you're no longer pushing. You're no longer trying to pull them out of hiding, and in that stillness, they feel something they never had to before: accountability. That's the power of stillness. It repositions you. It moves you from emotional dependence to spiritual discernment. It says, I'm no longer dancing around your wounds just to keep the peace. It says, I love you, but I won't enable you. And as you hold that line, not with attitude, but with authority, you take back your power. Not to dominate, but to define how you will be treated, to define what kind of love you're available for, to define the emotional climate you're willing to live in. Stillness removes the noise that distracts you from your worth. It gives you space to remember who you are, because sometimes we get so caught up in trying to be chosen, we forget that we're already called. And when you stop moving out of desperation, you start moving in divine timing. You allow God to speak into the space that once was filled with stress and striving, and He begins to realign your vision, showing you that love doesn't require you to lose yourself to prove yourself. Now here's the part that many don't expect. Your stillness creates discomfort for them. The person who once felt secure in your pursuit starts to question what changed. They wonder if they've lost their grip. They wonder if you've moved on. They may not show it, but they feel it, because the one who's always been there, always available, always emotionally generous, is suddenly unavailable. That stillness becomes a wake-up call. And not because you shouted, but because you stopped. But it's important to understand this isn't about control, it's about clarity. Your stillness doesn't manipulate, it reveals. It shows you what remains when you stop holding everything together. Do they step up? Do they reach out? Do they finally bring their full selves to the relationship? Or do they drift further into distance, confirming what you already sensed in your spirit? Either way, your stillness speaks. It says what your words couldn't say without being misunderstood. It declares without drama, this is where I end and you must choose whether to meet me here. Stillness also gives you time to heal, time to feel your feelings without judgment, time to unlearn the patterns that taught you love has to be earned through effort, time to rebuild the foundation of your identity, not on someone else's acceptance, but on God's affirmation. And in that restoration, you'll find a new kind of power, a gentle power, a rooted power, the kind that no longer begs for reciprocity but waits for alignment. Because when you're still, you're not just waiting on them, you're waiting on God. And God doesn't waste waiting. He uses it to strengthen, to clarify, and to prepare you for love that doesn't require you to shrink. Boundaries are not barriers to love. They are the bridges to healthy connection. And when you set a boundary through silence, it doesn't mean you're shutting someone out. It means you're inviting them into maturity, because silence paired with a boundary doesn't scream, it speaks with authority. It says, this is how I need to be loved. This is what I will no longer tolerate. This is where I stop over-functioning and start honoring myself. And in that sacred silence, people begin to reveal who they truly are, especially the ones who are avoidant. See, avoidant individuals are often uncomfortable with boundaries. They prefer open-ended access, loose definitions, gray areas. That way, they don't have to commit and they never have to grow. But when you go silent, not out of pride, but from a place of self-respect, they are forced to make a choice. Either they lean into discomfort and evolve, or they retreat even further into avoidance. Your silence exposes the heart. It separates those who are simply interested in your energy from those who are invested in your well-being. Because when you finally stop over-explaining your worth, when you stop negotiating your standards, when you stop performing emotional gymnastics to keep someone close, that's when truth rises to the surface. Not everyone wants to grow. Not everyone wants to face themselves. But those who do, those who hear your silence and feel the boundary behind it, they don't just notice the shift. They reflect. They start asking deeper questions. They begin to look at their own behavior not as a reaction to you, but as a reflection of their internal condition. And here's the part many overlook. Silence with boundaries is not passive. It takes incredible strength to stay silent when you've been misunderstood. It takes maturity to resist the urge to over-explain yourself just to keep peace. It takes discernment to know when the conversation has ended and the confrontation within must begin. You're not silent because you have nothing to say. You're silent because you're done wasting breath on ears that are closed. You've handed the situation over to God, And in doing so, you've created the very atmosphere where transformation can happen. But let's be honest, your silence will challenge them. It will confront their comfort zone, and that's a good thing because growth rarely happens in comfort. When someone who's been avoidant senses that they might actually lose access to your presence, your warmth, your patience, they are forced to choose. They can either dismiss you to protect their ego, or they can step into the unfamiliar terrain of growth to preserve what they're on the verge of losing. And you don't break your silence to check their progress. You don't shrink your boundaries to make them comfortable. You stay grounded, you stay prayerful, you stay open to growth but not addicted to outcome because you know by now, growth is a choice and love without growth becomes a cycle. A cycle you've already outgrown, so your boundary in silence becomes a mirror. It reflects back to them who they are, where they are, and whether they're ready to take the next step. But more importantly, it reflects back to you your own healing. Your own progress, your own strength, the you that no longer abandons herself for the sake of proximity, the you that knows peace is better than pretending, the you that has finally learned silence is not the absence of love, it's the presence of self-worth.